After that night, the camp logbook stayed empty. Not corrected, not replaced, just blank. And the strangest part, no one ever asked why. The order arrived near dusk. Typed brief final. It bypassed routine approval. It ignored standard procedure. And it named only one person. She wasn't trained for this assignment. She wasn't scheduled. And by regulation, she shouldn't have been sent at all. But the wording left no space for refusal. No threat. No justification. Just an expectation. Those who read it avoided eye contact. Those who passed it along said nothing. Whatever would follow, everyone already seemed to understand it couldn't be undone. The silence began before anything happened. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of interruption. No one stopped her. No one followed. No one explained what was expected once she arrived. That was the first pressure. She had treated injuries before. She had followed orders before. But never like this, without witnesses, without paperwork, without a clear boundary. Every rule she knew depended on being seen. This task depended on not being seen at all. As she moved deeper into the camp, the air felt heavier, as if the place itself was listening. She became aware of how isolated a uniform could make someone, how authority could surround you, while still leaving you completely alone. Her thoughts began to loop. If I refuse, what happens next? If I comply, does it still count as choice? There was no immediate fear. That came later. First came responsibility. The quiet kind that convinces you that silence is safer than resistance. She noticed how easily justification formed, how quickly the mind looks for reasons, when consequences are left undefined. No one threatened her. No one reassured her. And that uncertainty was deliberate. Because when instructions are vague, obedience becomes personal. Time stretched. Minutes lost their shape. She realized something unsettling. Whatever followed would not be remembered the same way by everyone present. And worse, some of it might not be remembered at all. That understanding settled in slowly, like a weight that doesn't crush, but never lifts. By the time she reached the assigned place, the decision had already been made. Not out loud, not on paper, but internally. And that was the moment she understood. The most lasting pressure in that camp was never physical. It was the quiet expectation that she would carry the memory alone. The camp had always been predictable, or at least it appeared that way. The guards moved in loops, the lights flickered on schedules, the gates opened and closed with mechanical certainty. That evening, nothing followed its usual rhythm. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A door lingered ajar that was never left unlocked. A guard hesitated in his step, eyes flicking toward her as though he expected her to vanish into nothing. The sound of boots on stone echoed differently, sharper, as if someone had slowed time itself. She noted it quietly, cautiously. Not once did anyone comment. Not a whisper, not a glance, not a shift in posture. And yet she felt it. Something fundamental had changed. Meals arrived later than usual. Lights in the infirmary stayed dimmer, longer, without reason. The air smelled slightly different. Metallic yet faintly sterile, almost too clean. Small, unnoticed deviations that should have been meaningless accumulated into a growing sense of unease. She began to question what was normal. If nothing was as it seemed, then could anything be trusted? The rules she had memorized, the schedules, the routines, the expected behavior. None of it applied anymore. Time no longer flowed in a straight line. Minutes stretched, hours collapsed. A patient she had treated an hour ago now appeared in a place she could not remember seeing them. Sheets were moved, supplies misplaced, orders that had been given were neither followed nor ignored, they simply didn't exist. It was subtle, unseen by anyone else, yet she could feel the ripple of change with every step. She began documenting mentally, nodding inconsistencies, trying to anchor herself. But the act of observation seemed to accelerate the anomalies. A guard would glance at her, then look away, leaving empty recognition in their eyes. A door would open in anticipation of no one. A voice would call a name that belonged to no one present. The camp had become a landscape of impossible echoes. Every shadow seemed to move on its own timeline. Every sound arrived slightly late or too early, like music being played off tempo. She tried to tell herself it was fatigue, a psychological reaction to isolation. But even in her most rational moments, she could not deny it. The camp itself was changing around her. By the third hour, repetition began to dominate. One sound returned again and again, the scrape of a chair, the faint hum of a distant generator, the sudden click of boots on stone. One visual anomaly repeated, a shadow stretching where there should be none, a door opening to the same empty hallway multiple times, a light flickering in the same spot. Her mind began to anchor on these repeated details. She would anticipate them. She would brace for them. And yet, every repetition carried a subtle difference. Time felt elastic. Moments stretched and snapped back unpredictably. She caught herself staring at the same spot for minutes, convinced she had been there for hours. The more she tried to rationalize, the more chaotic everything became. Her thoughts looped. Her sense of control slipped. Her attention narrowed until she felt trapped inside her own awareness. Every unanswered question became heavier. Every unanswered detail accumulated like invisible bricks on her chest. She realized she had no choice but to move forward, even as each step reinforced the impression that she was walking into a puzzle with no solution. The camp no longer felt like a place of work. It was a living experiment, and she was the subject. The first sign was subtle. A report filed the previous night didn't match the memory she carried. She reread the document carefully. Every name, every condition, every symptom. It was almost the same, but just slightly off. Not wrong, not false, just missing context. It was as if the report remembered events differently than she had. She tried to dismiss it. A mistake, fatigue. After all, who would notice a few discrepancies? But the pattern continued. Supply lists didn't match reality. Beds that had been filled were recorded as empty. Patients who had received care seemed invisible in the logs. And it wasn't just the records. People around her acted as though certain nights had never existed. Colleagues passed her in the hall without greeting. Conversations froze when she entered. A quiet, collective silence settled around her presence. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't deliberate. It was absent. Like history itself had chosen not to acknowledge her actions. She began noticing files disappearing. Not tossed aside. Not shredded. Simply gone. Medical charts vanished from desks. Notes erased from ledgers. Electronic records, if they could have existed, would have been overwritten. She checked, double-checked, and then stopped. The effort felt futile. When she questioned a colleague, they offered vague answers, but quickly shifted topics. Their eyes avoided hers. Something had changed. Something fundamental. And yet the rules of the camp still applied. Duty remained. Protocol remained. Except for one thing, accountability. It had evaporated. The effect was cumulative. Each vanished record, each avoided question, each unexplained silence. They piled up like bricks on a path she had no choice but to walk. She tried to anchor herself. She documented mentally. She observed carefully. She remembered everything. But memory alone was powerless. Because when no one else acknowledged the events, the world began to treat them as if they had never happened. By the fourth day, the camp itself seemed to recognize her presence differently. Rooms felt smaller. Corridors felt longer. The air seemed heavier in spaces she had crossed before. Not one person remarked on it. Not one guard, not one patient, not one colleague. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying consequence. She had acted. She had obeyed. She had witnessed. And yet, the world insisted she had not. Days passed, but time no longer seemed linear. She moved through the camp as if walking in a fog. Familiar corridors felt unfamiliar. Doors opened into rooms that were subtly shifted. A bed a few inches to the left, a chair missing where it had always been. And the people, they were shadows of themselves. Colleagues glanced her way, then looked away. Conversation stopped mid-sentence when she approached. Even those who had been friendly before now treated her presence as if it had no place in their reality. It wasn't malice. It wasn't avoidance. It was erasure. She realized slowly that the camp itself was participating in this process. Records disappeared. Voices disappeared. The memory of her actions, as if carefully curated by some invisible hand, began to vanish from existence. And with each disappearance, the weight of isolation grew heavier. She tried to protest. She asked questions. She checked ledgers. She revisited patients' rooms. Nothing responded. The files had vanished. The people had moved on. The world acted as though the previous days had never existed. Every attempt to confirm reality was met with silence. Every record she could have used to prove herself had been quietly erased. Even her own recollection felt fragile, as if remembering too much might fracture under the pressure of everyone else forgetting. By the end of the second week, a chilling realization took root. It wasn't only the records. It wasn't only the people. It was the narrative itself. History had been rewritten around her. She had become a ghost in her own story. And yet she remained fully aware, fully conscious, fully present. She alone carried the memory of that night. Survivors behaved differently. They avoided the infirmary when she entered. They glanced at her as if she were a figment. When pressed, they spoke vaguely, memories blurred, recollections mismatched, sentences trailing off mid-thought. The camp itself seemed to acknowledge this transformation. Walls felt tighter, corridors longer, the air heavier, charged with a weight no one else noticed. She began to understand. Consequences had arrived quietly, slowly. Not as punishment, not as recognition, but as a structural erasure. The record of what happened had been removed. The witnesses had been erased from memory. The place itself had altered to accommodate the absence. And the most haunting consequence of all, even when she tried to tell someone, even when she tried to prove the events, the world refused to hear her. She was left with one thing: her own memory, and the certainty that some actions, some nights, leave no trace beyond the mind of the one who lived them. She walked through the camp, aware that everything had shifted. She knew what had occurred. She knew the pattern, the consequences, the silence. But the world, the official world, would never acknowledge it. It was gone, erased, unrecorded, and the absence of acknowledgement carried its own weight. Some events are not meant to be preserved. Some acts are remembered by no one but those who bore witness alone. And in that silence, the human mind becomes the only keeper of truth. She walked alone through the camp one last time. Everything looked normal, the gates, the barracks, the infirmary, yet she knew nothing was as it seemed. The shadows lingered longer than they should. The corridors felt both familiar and impossibly distant. Time had stretched, bent, and fractured around her presence. She paused at the infirmary doorway. No one greeted her. No one spoke. Even the air felt heavier here, carrying a weight that no one else noticed. And then she realized the camp wasn't silent because nothing had happened. It was silent because the world had decided that her actions, her choices, her courage, her presence would leave no trace. She was the only one who remembered. And that memory was hers alone. Outside, the wind whispered through the empty streets of the camp. It carried no answers, no judgments, no recognition. It only reminded her that some events resist records, resist retellings, resist history itself. She tried to speak the story aloud, but words failed her. Even the act of narrating felt like bending against a current too strong to resist. The events, the people, the consequences, they had been quietly erased from the world. And in that erasure, a question remained. If no one sees it, if no one writes it down, does it matter at all? She knew the answer in her heart. It mattered. It always mattered. But the world would never acknowledge it. The camp stood still. Records missing. Memories suppressed. Silence unbroken. And she walked away, carrying a truth invisible to everyone else. Because sometimes the greatest acts of courage, the most profound consequences, and the deepest moral dilemmas exist only in the mind of the one who lived them. And that is the haunting truth. The night she entered the camp, and everything that followed, would never be recorded, but it would never be forgotten.